There are many myths about Jesus. In these programs, we're talking to some experts who can help us get at the facts behind the myths. Skeptical scholars used to believe that the Bible's accounts of Jesus were written long after he lived, maybe in the 2nd century, by people who didn't know about the real Jesus. Professor Dan Wallace is one of the world's leading experts on the handwritten copies of the Bible's accounts. Here, he explains how the discovery of the earliest copy of one of these accounts overturned the ideas of scholars, and showed that the accounts had been written much earlier than they thought.
Perhaps the oldest fragment is papyrus number 52, also known as John Ryland's papyrus number 457, and this is housed at the John Rylands Library of Manchester University in England. It was discovered in 1934 by C.H. Roberts, who was a man recently doctored, got his PhD in papyrology and in classics, and he was rummaging around in the library of the John Rylands and discovered this fragment that is no larger than the palm of my hand, 2.5 inches by 3.5 inches. And the interesting thing about this fragment was it was written on both sides. What that told him almost immediately, it was probably a Christian fragment. The reason is, if it's written on both sides, then it would have been written on a codex, which is our modern book form, invented at the end of the 1st century AD. A codex where you bind it on one side, then you have cut pages that you flip, as opposed to the roll or the scroll that all other books at the time had been written on. And so this is written on both sides, and John 18:31 through 33 was on one side, John 18:37 and 38 on the other. 90 years earlier than when C.H. Roberts discovered this fragment, in 1844 in the journal The Tübinger Jahrbuch, F.C. Bauer of Tübingen University had argued that John's Gospel cannot be dated any earlier than AD 160, and most likely was to be dated about AD 170. He was basing this on philosophical constructs that he had learned from his professor of philosophy, Hegel, who had come up with Hegelian dialectic, which we may know as thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. And so through a convoluted philosophical construct, Bauer argued John's Gospel can't be dated any earlier than 160 and probably 170. And through that approach of bringing Hegelian dialectic into New Testament studies, what happened was European scholar after European scholar for the next 90 years started to late date the Gospel of John. Obviously, if it's in the second half of the 2nd century, then it has no eyewitness credibility to it, and so its historical reliability was completely dashed. But then when Roberts discovers this small fragment, he gets it published in 1935 after he had sent photographs of it to the 3 leading papyrologists in Europe at the time. Each one of them wrote back to him and said, this manuscript cannot be dated any later than AD 150 and should be dated closer to AD 100. A fourth demurred. He said, no, I think this should be dated in the 90s of the 1st century. So you have these scholars who are saying the copy of John's Gospel can't be dated later than 150. It's probably closer to 100. Typically, we date that at about 125 now, but really it's a date between 100 and 150. But here's the interesting thing. Generally speaking, a copy of a manuscript is not written before the original of the document. This sent 2 tons of European scholarship to the flames and brought John's Gospel back into the 1st century, and with that and the Dead Sea Scrolls and some other things that have occurred in the last few decades, now we're beginning to see that John's Gospel has historical credibility.
The myth is that the Bible's accounts of Jesus were written long after he lived, by people who didn't know much about the real Jesus. The fact is that the accounts were written very early, within living memory of Jesus.
I give you this again, it's a set of YouTube videos called God New Evidence that you can look up many more things like this. What's so exciting about that, as he said, is that the early dating of it by scholars who aren't trying to be biased about it. They said, based on the type of text and other things that date it somewhere between AD 90 and maybe at the very latest AD 150. Do any of you remember, or have you had the Gospel of John yet to know what the typical dating of when the original Gospel of John was written? What's the consensus somewhere between the AD 70s and the AD early 90s is when it's thought that John wrote it late, much later than the other Gospels. He was the last apostle alive. The other Gospels have already been written. He's lived long enough and he's worked with the churches long enough to know that some questions were arising about what did Jesus teach, or who was he really, that wasn't easily answered from the Gospels that were already out there. And that helps perhaps explain, that's my opinion, it perhaps explains why his Gospel seems so different than the others. That he covers different miracles by and large than the other Gospels cover. He has different teachings of Jesus from the others. Not contradictory, complementary, but they're different. And he knew the church needed some things that was not in the other Gospels, so he wrote his. So the typical dating is usually the AD 80s or maybe AD 90 at the latest. Well, if all of a sudden we're looking at a little fragment of a manuscript found in Egypt, by the way, not in the Holy Land, that already John has not only been written, but is circulating, and someone's made a copy of it, and maybe this is a copy of it, and yet here it is down in Egypt. We're very, very close to the autograph. And yes, it only has parts of, I think, 4 verses on it between the two sides together. But amazing, what is there is just like in the later manuscripts from all around the Roman Empire that we have. It hadn't been changed, except for by and large, just the errors that crept in by, scribes being fallible human beings just like us, that they made mistakes sometimes and they're making copies of things. So it's really a fascinating one for us to know about. I brought a book with me that it's one of these books I'm always a sucker for, that not only does it tell us called The Story of the Bible by Larry Stone, and it's interesting enough on its own, but they have these sections where they actually reproduce photographic copies of the originals. And so here's a reproduced copy of a page out of Codex Vaticanus. It's actually 100% full size for what Codex Vaticanus is. And it gives you a sense, if you were to come up and look at it after class is over or whatever, how they wrote in that time. All capitals, in columns, no space between the words, no punctuation. If they made a mistake, you can see little notes out in the margin where they tried to correct a mistake they made in it and so forth. That's Codex Vaticanus, dated probably AD 325. Then there's Codex Sinaiticus. This is the one that makes good lighter for a fire. This is a page from it, full size. This is what survived. Amazingly, I've read some critics say, you can't trust Codex Sinaiticus because part of it's missing. Well, of course part of it's missing. We're fortunate we have what we do. If he hadn't stopped the monk from setting it on fire over the next few weeks, they would have burned the whole thing up. And we don't know how many others they had used for kindling for their fires in the days, months, years, and centuries before Tischendorf got there and discovered this one. And then a slightly later than the John Ryland's manuscript, but dated between AD 175 and 225, it's called the Chester Beatty Papyri, P46. Again on papyrus, much larger. This is the actual size. You can see it's rough around the edges where it's rotted away. But, it's not written in the column form like the later Vaticanus and Sinaiticus are, which was actually what they were doing whole Bibles with. But this would be, a Christian scribe. See the middle where the page was folded because it was papyrus. That was a book form. And you might like to see that as well. It's the beginning of the Gospel to the Galatians, it says. And there's Galatians by Paul. By the way, I wanted to mention, and I went on past it when we had it up in the first half of the class, about these corroborating evidences. Remember when we studied about Marcion? He was around AD 144, and slightly after that, he came out with his own canon of Scripture. How could he do that if those documents weren't already in existence? And how could the church respond to him if they didn't already have their own copies by which they could say, hey, you can't go in and change Luke the way you did. He rewrote Luke, leaving out the things he didn't want in there because it didn't agree with his doctrine. And he used 10 of Paul's epistles, and that was his entire Bible, was a revised version of Luke and a slightly revised set of 10 of Paul's epistles. Again, that testifies those were already out there, widely known, widely used in the church, and that's why this fella could take a set of them and change them up to suit him a little bit and try to put them out as the authoritative Scripture, and while the church could respond to that and say no. And what you're doing is not only heresy, but you're changing the revelation from God that comes through the original writers, apostles and evangelists of the church. Okay. Well, that's that. This other one is longer, but I think it's worth us watching. In fact, it's going to take up most of the rest of the time. I may decide at some point to step in and stop it. It's by Michael J. Kruger, and he's talking about why can we have confidence that the 4 Gospels we have are, number one, written by the authors that have traditionally been ascribed to them, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then secondly, why not other Gospels? Why not the Gospel of Peter? Why not the Gospel of Mary? Why not the Gospel of the 12 Apostles? Those are all other ones that at a later date were out there, but the church rejected. And so he's talking about that, and he's speaking at what's called a Ligonier conference, which is where a lot of seminary students and their professors attend and so forth. We're not necessarily connected with them in any way because it's Reformed churches. But I think you'll enjoy hearing this. At some point, I'll probably stop it before he's finished, but I do recommend that you go listen to all of it because his arguments are pretty simple. But, he's saying, here's what the facts are, and this is the interpretation he makes of them. These are the conclusions he draws from that he thinks are most reasonable.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate that introduction. And indeed, the first lesson of Canon is spelling it rightly. So I tell my students all the time, if you're going to pass my papers, at least start there. Get the spelling of it correct. But no, it is great to be here at Ligonier. I've done a number of things for Ligonier in the past, writing and doing the radio show, but have yet to speak at an event, so it's a pleasure to be here. And what makes this event special is not just the folks I'm sharing the stage with, which are scholars in their own right, and it's such a blessing to be among them, but about this time last week in Charlotte, North Carolina, the low was 7 degrees. And so as I flew down here and saw the weather report, I thought to myself, I have found my home. In Orlando, Sanford, Southern Florida, what have you. And so it is great to be with you. Unfortunately, I have to get back on a plane in a few days and leave. But I trust my weather will have warmed up by then in Charlotte. Now, I can't imagine a title of a conference more fitting for my own area of interest than this one, Scripture in the Early Church. They've asked me to speak on God's Word in the early church, and as you might guess, that's an enormous and vast topic. And so I want to narrow down our time together. We only have a limited amount of time together to talk about a more specific subset of that. And I want to begin in a very unusual place today, in a way you probably don't expect to talk on Scripture in the early church to begin. I want to begin by talking about Muhammad Ali. Now, I know you're thinking, now that's the strangest thing I've ever heard. Here we are at a Ligonier conference at Reformation Bible College, and we're talking about Scripture in the early church, and they just read off all this list of titles, and I'm going to talk about the boxer, Muhammad Ali. What in the world? But I'm not going to talk about the boxer, Muhammad Ali. I actually want to talk about the shepherd, Muhammad Ali. In fact, the shepherd, Muhammad Ali, is probably a person you've never heard of before. But in 1945, Muhammad Ali, in a little town called Nag Hammadi, Egypt, stumbled upon what is arguably one of the most fascinating, controversial, and interesting archaeological discoveries in the history of the modern world. Muhammad Ali was out in his field, as a good shepherd would do in 1945, digging in the ground for fertilizer to help his crops and his animals and so forth, and he was with his brother Sharif Ali, and as they're digging in the ground, their shovel hit something hard. In fact, it's almost like something out of a movie. They began to sweep the dirt away, and as they swept the dirt away, they uncovered this earthenware jar. And it At the very top, it was sealed. And they began to wonder what might be inside. Now, of course, this is where Muhammad Ali had his delusions of grandeur. He thought, wow, this could be the moment I've been waiting for. Buried treasure. Surely inside here is gold and jewels and all sorts of things, and our problems are solved. We don't have to be shepherds anymore. We can be rich and famous and so on. But his brother Sharif Ali said, hold on, don't break it open. There might be a genie inside who will curse us. Now, of course, back and forth the debate went, and finally decided that the potential treasure inside was much more important than being cursed by a genie, so they cracked it open. And they were grandly disappointed. Because what they found inside was not treasure. What they found inside was not books and not gold and not jewels. What they found inside, in fact, were boring old books. In fact, books they couldn't even read. Books written in a language that had long been forgotten, books that seemed bizarre and old, books that were brittle and boring. They thought, what in the world are these? And they figured, oh, I wish it had been gold. And they ended up selling off these books to the latest antiquities dealer for hardly anything at all, not realizing they discovered one of the most interesting collections of writings in early Christianity, what ultimately became known as the Gnostic Gospels. Now, the Gnostic Gospel is just a phrase we use that describes this collection of writings. Actually, it was 13 codices, individual books, and inside those 13 codices were 52 individual writings, what we call tractates. And at the center of these Gnostic Gospels became one of the most famous books that you and I have heard of out there that never made its way into the New Testament. It's a book that the media loves to talk about and that scholars love to sort of dive into. It's a book known as the Gospel of Thomas. Muhammad Ali had discovered an entire collection of books that did not make it into our New Testament canons. And at the center of it was this book, esoteric and strange, known as the Gospel of Thomas. And if you read Thomas, yes, you're reading purportedly about Jesus, but when you read Thomas, you realize this doesn't sound like the Jesus I know. This Jesus doesn't talk about himself as divine, but kind of talks about us as divine. This Jesus doesn't talk about salvation from the outside. This Jesus talks about salvation from the inside. This Jesus is not saying the normal things we expect Jesus to say. And so the Gospel of Thomas became one of the most interesting and fascinating Gospels to media critics and scholars all over the world. And Muhammad Ali had discovered it without even knowing it. Now, ever since that time, 1945, the Gospel of Thomas has captured the fascination of our world. People in our world are fascinated with lost gospels, and that really brings us to the topic before us today, and that is what I want to focus on in this narrow window of discussion on Scripture in the early church is, what about those gospels? Why are those not in the canon? And for that matter, what do we do with the stories of Jesus in there? I mean, what if someone came along and said, look, aren't these just as valid as the stories of Jesus in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? And why should we prefer Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? And maybe Gospel of Thomas is the real version of Jesus, and maybe our Gospels are the wrong version of Jesus. How do we know we have the right Gospels and not the wrong Gospels? Now, you and I, as we think about interacting with our modern world, have got to have an answer to that question. The reason is because our neighbor, who's not a Christian, reads Time magazine, and it seems like every Easter or Christmas there's an article in there about something related to Christianity, and usually they bring up things like the Gospel of Thomas. Or you have another non-Christian friend who took a university class, and they had a famous professor there who told them all about apocryphal Gospels and how those are really more important and more authoritative and probably more likely to be true than the Gospels you're reading. And so as believers, we have to have some answer to that question. So here's what I want to do today. One shot at a conference like this to help you think about Scripture in the early church. I want to help give you the reasons why Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John stand out as unique among all the Gospels in the history of early Christianity. In other words, what I want to do today is I'm going to lay out 4 basic facts, which actually, when you hear them in a moment, you're going to think, well, I knew that fact, and that fact's not that hard to remember. 4 basic facts about our canonical Gospels that remind us why they're unique, why they're distinctive, why they're different than the Gospel of Thomas, and why they ended up in the canon and not these other Gospels. And my hope today is that these, in some sense, will be sort of 4 talking points that you can sort of tuck away in your mind and hopefully at some point bring up in a conversation with your neighbor or non-Christian friend, or maybe even just a Christian who's struggling and wants to know an answer why Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John really are unique among the Gospels in early Christianity. Now, before I dive into those 4 sort of talking points, I want to first dial things back a moment and ask a larger question before we get into that. I want to sort of set the scene by asking a question about why our culture is so fascinated with lost gospels in the first place. I don't think there's any real doubt that our culture is. It's interesting that this is one of those topics that transcends the academy. I've been interested to observe over the years that in academic circles, we scholars like to talk about lots of things that for most laymen, relatively boring. If I bring up some topics we like to discuss, I can see the eyes glaze over and you're checked out 5 minutes in. But what's interesting is you bring up a lost gospel and everybody's listening. Layperson, scholar alike. And you know what? The scholars know this, and that's why you've probably seen over the last 10, 15, 20 years a push to put in front of you these lost gospels, to rattle your confidence in the stability of the canon. There is a fascination in our world in these other stories of Jesus, what we call apocryphal gospels, and I want to simply ask the question, why? Now, I have my own theory on this. It's not really a theory. I think there's good reasons to think there's something that's led to this. And let me just give you my sort of big picture here. I'm confident there's a link between our culture's fascination with diversity and our culture's fascination with lost gospels. And let me explain what I mean. When I use the term diversity here, I'm not talking about ethnic diversity or cultural diversity or racial diversity. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about our culture's fascination with the diversity of ideas, with the diversity of religions, with the diversity of thought, a diversity of convictions. It doesn't take much living in our modern world to realize that there's a drip, drip, drip all around us in our world of our culture telling us, look at all the different religions, look at all the different philosophies, look at all the different worldviews. They want to put that in front of us regularly and all the time. And by the way, they're right about all the differences. There's no one disputes the extent of the diversity of ideas. But it's this next step that our culture takes that's so key. They don't just observe diversity, they draw an implication from diversity. And it's that second thing that's so noteworthy. In other words, we can agree with our culture. There's a lot of diverse ideas out there. I mean, who's going to dispute that? But then our culture says, because there's so many diverse ideas out there, therefore no one view can be right. And it's that second step, the implication that's drawn from diversity, that's so significant in our culture. And you know what's interesting is that most of us don't notice the second step. They move so seamlessly from observing diversity of thought to the implication that therefore no one view can be right, that we don't even notice that there's a leap between the two. The first is undisputed. The second is highly doubtful. Just because there's a diversity of ideas and views of something doesn't mean there can't be one view. Now, that idea out there in the culture broadly, and this is what I want you to see, has seeped into the world of scholarship. It's actually seeped into the world of early Christian studies in particular. This has a whole historical background to it I can't go into here in our session, but when you trace the history of scholarship, there's been this fascination with finding diversity in early Christianity to show that there's not just one Christianity in the early church, but Christianities, plural. So scholars will look at early Christianity and say, well, there's no such thing as Christianity in the first 4 centuries, because everyone disagreed about all kinds of things. There was controversy and doctrinal dispute. So there wasn't Christianity in the first few centuries. There was Christianities, plural. And here's the catch. And each version of Christianity in the early church had its own books. So therefore, in early Christianity, you might have one version of Christian thought, maybe a Gnostic thought or a Docetic thought or some sort of monastic thought, or maybe you were a Montanist or whatever happens to be in early Christianity. Each of those groups has their own set of writings. So modern scholars say, and your neighbor says to you, what's so special about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John anyway? That's just the books of that one subgroup within early Christianity. What if another group had won? What if the Gnostics had won? If the Gnostics had won the theological wars in early Christianity, you wouldn't be reading Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. If the Gnostics had won, you'd be reading the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Truth. So your canon, so to speak, is just the result of accidental and arbitrary events in history, and there's nothing any more special about those books than Thomas or any other. And here's the big payoff. If that's true, then when it comes to which Jesus you prefer, you can just find the book that has the Jesus you like the best. And this is where I think we really get to the nub of it in terms of our culture's fascination with lost gospels. Why does our culture love lost gospels? Because they don't want there to be one way. They don't want there to be one option. They don't want there to be one particular version of Jesus. What our culture wants is a plethora of versions of Jesus, so you can just pick the Jesus you happen to prefer. If you like the Jesus in Thomas, well, great, that's just as valid. If you like the Jesus in the Gospel of Philip, that's just as valid, says our world. And so what I want you to see is that the debate over these lost gospels has to be set within a larger cultural conversation about the diversity of ideas. And you can see that that's pressing in on the debate, and the major message to you is simply this: it doesn't matter what gospel you read. They're all equally valid. None are more valid than any other gospel. You can just pick the Jesus that suits your fancy in whichever gospel you happen to prefer. Now, I can tell you something. That narrative is persuasive to most people, but here's the big problem with it. That narrative only works if you decide you don't want to do any historical investigations. That narrative only works if you want to stand sort of unaware of the actual data about the individual gospels. So what I want to do is I want you within that backdrop now to hear the four basic differences in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the four things that make those unique as opposed to gospels like Thomas, and you'll discover something very quickly, and that is, wait a second, all that rhetoric about all gospels being the same actually doesn't work if you actually know something about these gospels. And that's what we're going to do. So here's the four things that we'll dive in, and we're just going to work through these one at a time, and hopefully these will be the kind of four sort of principles you can take home, four things that set our gospels apart from gospels like Thomas. And the first is simply this: our four gospels, the canonical gospels, are the earliest gospels we have. They are the earliest gospels that we possess. Now, what's interesting about that first point is how utterly basic it is, how simple and uncomplicated it is. It's simply this: our four gospels are the only gospels that take us into the first century. They're the only gospels written in the first century. They're the only gospels dated to the first century. What's curious about that fact is that it's actually pretty much a scholarly consensus that the four gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are dated to the first century. In fact, it's not only a scholarly consensus that those four gospels are dated to the first century, it is a scholarly consensus that no other gospels in existence are dated to the first century. All are second century or later. Now, I can tell you something, in the world of scholarship, there's very rarely a consensus on much of anything. You get 4 or 5 scholars in a room and just throw out a subject and, good luck getting them to agree. In the world of biblical scholarship in particular, there's hardly any consensus on things. And the fact that you could have consensus on this fundamental point is stunning. Now, every once in a while, there'll be a scholar who gets up the gumption to say, hey, I'm going to give it a go again and try to get some other gospel dated to the first century. And they often do it with a gospel like Thomas. And they say, well, I've got a new argument now. I've got a reason to think Thomas really is a first century text. And they try to push it back. And the scholarly community listens for a little bit and goes, yeah, not working. And they always end up in the same place. The only 4 gospels written in the first century are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They take us further, deeper, closer to the actual events they purport to record than any other gospel available to us. Now, in the world of historical study and historical investigation, if you're wanting to ascertain the reliability of a document and whether the history it's recording is reliable, the basic rule of thumb is you want that document to be written as close to the events it purports to record as you possibly can get. I mean, think about it with me for a moment. What if our earliest gospel was written in, say, 400 AD? Just think about that. You would have an obvious question. Wait a second. If it was written in 400 AD, well, how does someone in 400 AD remember anything that happened in the first century? I mean, couldn't the story have been changed and modified? And how do we know it was reliable? And so on. And so you want a document that's as close as possible to the historical events it's purporting to record. And the only documents that get you there in all of early Christianity, that get you in the first century at all, are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They're the only ones. And there's scholarly agreement about that across the board. Now, a couple implications from that before we leave this first point that are, I think, fundamental. One is, this already gives us an inclination to think that the most reliable stories of Jesus we're going to get are going to be in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John because they are closest. So it already gives us the principle, the closer you get to the events of Jesus, the better. Okay. But there's a second implication which most people miss, and this is really critical. It means that when the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were published, if they were published in the first century, and they were, if they were published in the first century, that tells us that when those Gospels were published, there were other people still alive that had witnessed the things that they were discussing. There were other people that were still alive that had saw those things take place. In other words, when the 4 Gospels were written, there were other people around who could say, wait a second, that's not how it happened. That's not what took place. I was there. And this is the point that most people miss, is that if you're going to publish a gospel in the lifetime of the people who are eyewitnesses, you had better get your facts straight, because it's never going to see the light of day if it doesn't. Now, people all the time say, oh, that's not the way it worked in the ancient world. No one really cared about how you did history in the ancient world. It was a total free-for-all. No one paid attention to such things. That's simply not true. We have actually all kinds of discussions amongst Greco-Roman historians about how you do good history and what counts as good history and how you want to be as close to the events as possible, critiquing people for doing poor history. No, make no mistake about it. If you published Gospels in the first century and there are other people alive who had seen those things and you were just making it up, it never would have seen the light of day. What you have then, right out of the gate here, is a fundamental difference between our four Gospels and every other Gospel out there. These are the only Gospels that get us back to the first century, to the time that Jesus actually did the things that are recorded in there. Now, on one level, you could stop here. I guess I could give you a one-point outline today. That'd be pretty nice, right? When's the last time you heard a one-point outline on anything? Usually in the world of sermons and lectures, it's 3, 4, 5, 7, what happens to be. Theoretically, I could just give you this one point, and that would be enough. That one fact. But there's so much more here that can be said. I think that's compelling enough. And by the way, notice how when you articulate that reality, that these are just the oldest ones we have, these Gospels get us further and closer than any other Gospel, your neighbor can understand that fact. Your neighbor can get that. They can understand that. And no other apocryphal Gospel gets you to the first century. It was written many years later. Okay, second thing that sets our canonical Gospels apart and makes them unique. Not just when they were written. First point was that they're the earliest Gospels we have. The second is the canonical Gospels have a credible connection to the apostles. The canonical Gospels have a credible connection to the apostles. I want you to notice our first point was about the date of the Gospels, which is really important when they were written. This second point is not just about the date. This second point is about the author of the Gospels. If you wanted to get the best source for the life of Jesus, you wouldn't want just a gospel that was written as early as you could get. That would be good, and we have that in our 4. But you would also want a gospel written by someone who actually could have known these things, who actually could have seen these things. You would want a gospel written by an eyewitness, or at least someone who had an eyewitness right next to him to tell him what took place. In other words, if you wanted a gospel that was utterly reliable, you would want it written by some of Jesus' closest friends. Now, we know historically about the 12 apostles, the 12 disciples of Jesus, really 11 eventually after Judas committed suicide. We know these were his closest companions. These are the ones he relied on. These are the ones he poured his information into and his life into. If anybody would have known what Jesus was about, if anybody would have known the message of Christ, if anyone would have had a good shot of getting it right, it would have been these closest companions. Sure, someone from the outside might have been able to get the message right. Someone watching from a distance, Jesus do what he does, could have gotten the message right. But if you really want a good shot of getting the message right, to understand the nuts and bolts of who Jesus is and what he came to do and what his identity was, you're going to want to get access to his closest companions and what they thought. And here's the trick. The only Gospels that even have a shot, and we would argue more than a shot, but the only Gospels that even have a shot of getting you access to the apostles are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These are the only Gospels that we think were either written by apostles or written by the companion of an apostle who would have access to the information we're describing. Now, of course, in a session like this, we can't go into all the examples out there about how we know who wrote the Gospels and how we know who the authors were and things like this. And so I can't go through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in this session and tell you how we know who wrote them, but I'll just give you one example, and that is focusing on the person of John and the Gospel of John. Let's just think about the Gospel of John for a moment. How do we know John wrote John? It says John on there, right? But how do we know he actually wrote it? How do we know he's the guy that was there at the Last Supper, who Jesus had him lean into Jesus' chest, and they were very close, and he was called the beloved disciple? How do we know that guy actually wrote the book? How do we know it's not a forgery or pseudonymous? How do we know it wasn't a later? How do we know that John wrote John? Well, there's all kinds of ways we can get at that, but I just want to point out one, and it's pretty fascinating. One of the ways we know the authors of these Gospels is by the testimony of the early church fathers that were really, really close to the time period. So how do we know John wrote John? Well, we have the testimony of a 2nd century church father by the name of Irenaeus. It tells us very plainly, John wrote John. It was the John who was there, disciple, leaned his head on Jesus' chest. That John wrote this gospel. Okay, so we have that testimony from Irenaeus. But how do we know Irenaeus is right? Well, we'd have to ask where Irenaeus got his information from. And without going into all the details, it's undoubtedly the case that he got his information from an earlier individual by the name of Polycarp, who was one of the earliest and most sort of well-known bishops in early Christianity. So how did Polycarp get that information? Well, here's the stunner. Polycarp was mentored by the Apostle John himself. In other words, the Apostle John mentored a guy named Polycarp, who mentored a guy named Irenaeus. And Irenaeus comes along and says, hey, John wrote John. And he's only one person removed from John himself. Only one person. He knows the guy who got it from John. Now, on an historical level, I can tell you, that is a stunning, tight line of testimony. It's so powerful, in fact, that in a court of law, that would be a very compelling testimony, because you have to ask the question, what's the statistical chance that Irenaeus just got it wrong? Or what's the chance that Polycarp got it wrong? Well, he knows John himself. Or what's the chance he's lying or making it up? Well, fairly low when you look at the historical circumstances. All that points to one simple fact, that the person who wrote the gospel we call John was right there watching it happen. Now, if that's true for the canonical gospels, and we don't have time to go through Matthew, Mark, and Luke, if that's true for the canonical gospels, what about the apocryphal gospels? Were they written by somebody who was there? Well, here's the amazing thing about the apocryphal gospels. You already know none of them are written in the first century. All of them are written in the second century or later, right? So if that's true, then none of the apocryphal gospels, they weren't even written in the first century, but they certainly weren't written by an eyewitness, nor were they written by someone who had access to an eyewitness so far after the fact. None of them could have had that same access to that truth. Now, people get hung up all the time on the names of these apocryphal gospels. Well, gee whiz, if it wasn't written by Thomas, why is it called the Gospel of Thomas? If it wasn't written by Peter, why is it called the Gospel of Peter? But you have to ask yourself, if you lived in the second century and you wanted to write a gospel that would get a hearing, what would you call it? You wouldn't call it Bob's Gospel, right? Bob's Gospel is not going to get a hearing. But if you call it Peter's Gospel, suddenly people are listening. Could Peter have written that? And it probably did fool some people. If you call it the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Philip, it would probably fool some people. But you know what's happening there? Those apocryphal Gospels are just mimicking what the canonical Gospels had already done by picking names of the followers of Jesus. We even have an apocryphal Gospel called the Gospel of the 12. It's almost like that Gospel says, well, I'll trump all of you. I've got a Gospel written by all 12 disciples. Here's the point. Even with all the rhetoric and all the labels and all the things, we know none of those Gospels give you access to the apostles themselves. And here's the implication of this second point. If we have a gospel in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that gives us access to the closest followers of Jesus, then not only do we have eyewitness testimony in our grasp, no other apocryphal gospel can say that, but we have authoritative eyewitness testimony in our grasp. Because the apostles weren't just friends of Jesus. They were commissioned by Jesus. They were given the authority of Jesus. They were sent out by Jesus. So to say that you have an apostolic gospel is not just to say you have an eyewitness gospel. To say you have an apostolic gospel is to say you have an eyewitness gospel that's also an authoritative gospel. Now, once you realize you have an authoritative gospel, then the idea that just any old gospel is as good as any other suddenly just kind of fades away. Because if you were trying to decide which gospel to trust, wouldn't you want a gospel that not only was early, but also written by somebody who was actually there or had access to somebody who was there? Make no mistake about it, with these first 2 points already, you can see that, wait a second, maybe it's not as arbitrary as people think. Maybe it's not just a free-for-all. Maybe there's a reason why Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John ended up in our canons. Let's move on to the third of the 4 points. First one was the canonical gospels are the earliest. The second is the canonical gospels are the only ones with a credible connection to the apostles. The third is the canonical gospels lack the legendary embellishments of later gospels. They lack the legendary embellishments of later gospels. And one of the things I've discovered over the years, talking a lot about the early Christian church and the canon and apocryphal gospels and canonical gospels, one of the things I've discovered over the years is not many people have actually read the apocryphal gospels. In fact, I would argue that not many people have actually read the canonical gospels. That's another discussion altogether. But at least more of them have. And so when I tell someone, look, these are qualitatively different kinds of writings, people just shrug and go, yeah, so you say. But the truth of the matter is most people haven't read them, because when you read the canonical gospels and you read them alongside books like the Gospel of Peter or the Gospel of Philip or the Gospel of Thomas, you realize there's something very different going on here. And here's one of the things that you notice. You begin to realize how restrained and how matter of fact and sort of how almost like a newspaper reporter the canonical Gospels are. You never notice that because you just read them and think, okay, here's the Gospels we have. But when you compare them to these other texts, you realize those other texts are loaded with all kinds of obvious embellishments, extraneous material, bizarre and strange content, and stuff that is clearly superfluous and added later. And you begin to realize there's something very unusual going on when you read the canonical Gospels. And I'll give you a couple examples just to sort of highlight what I'm talking about. You ever notice how when you read the canonical Gospels that you never actually see the resurrection take place when you read them? I don't know if you ever noticed this before. In the canonical Gospels, when you look at the resurrection accounts, you have the resurrection accounts, and when the women show up at the tomb, what's already taken place? Jesus has already risen from the dead. In fact, he's not only risen from the dead, he's not even there anymore. So the resurrection has already happened, and you show up on the scene in the narrative with it already having taken place. Now, it's never dawned on you that if someone were actually just concocting a gospel and the resurrection was the centerpiece of their narrative, wouldn't you actually want to show it happening? Wouldn't you actually create a scenario where there was an eyewitness of it taking place, where you actually see Jesus come out of the tomb? That would seem compelling to me. In fact, you could see how that might be an even more powerful testimony to the resurrection of Jesus. But what's amazing is that when you read the canonical Gospels, that's not what you get. In fact, you get what seems to have really happened. They showed up and it already took place. You don't get to watch it happen. It's amazingly restrained for an historical report. I'll give you a second example of the restraint in the canonical Gospels, and that is how little we know about the childhood of Jesus in the canonical Gospels. Now, of course, we have that one story of Jesus as a boy in the temple in Luke. Okay, that's there. But outside of that, there's not much there. And you can imagine how curious people might be about something like that. I mean, if you wrote a gospel, wouldn't you want to include something about Jesus as a child? Wouldn't that be something you'd want to say something about? Wouldn't that be something you'd want to know something about? Don't you think your listeners would want to hear something about that? And wouldn't you wonder things like, I wonder what Jesus was like when he was growing up. I wonder if he ever got spanked by his parents, you know? I wonder if he ever got in trouble. I wonder what he was like as this little son of God running around. I wonder how many times his brothers and sisters heard the phrase, why can't you be more like your brother Jesus, right? What was it like for Jesus as a boy? Now, when you read the canonical Gospels, what's incredible is how restrained. They just don't dump all these stories in there, even though the curiosity must have been immense. Now, you don't notice the oddity of that, and when I say oddity, I mean it positively here, the uniqueness of that when you haven't read apocryphal Gospels. If you've read apocryphal Gospels, you realize they have very little of this, most of them. They have all kinds of obvious legendary embellishments. So let me ask this question. How many here have not just heard of, but have actually read the Gospel of Thomas? 7, 8, maybe 10 here. By the way, Steve Nichols, that's probably a good sign here at Reformation Bible College, right? You don't want your students necessarily doing their devotions in the Gospel of Thomas. Okay, let me ask a second question. How many here have not just heard of, but have actually read the Gospel of Peter? Maybe one hand, two? Okay, so this group is statistically consistent with most of the groups I speak at. Most people haven't read them. But let me tell you, when you go to these apocryphal Gospels, you're going to see something in both these areas. So let me give you an example of where we see Jesus resurrected from the dead and we see Jesus as a boy in these examples. I'll start with the resurrection of the dead. When we read a gospel called the Gospel of Peter, not written by Peter, written by someone we don't know who in the late 2nd, maybe early 3rd century, the Gospel of Peter actually shows you the resurrection happening. Later today, you can Google it don't do it now, but later today, you can go Google the Gospel of Peter and you can read about it, and it shows you the resurrection taking place. What the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John don't show you, the Gospel of Peter actually shows you. And so what happens? The tomb opens up and out comes Jesus, and you get to see it happen. But as soon as you start maybe thinking, well, this is kind of cool, then bizarre things start to happen in this gospel. Because first of all, when Jesus comes out of the tomb, he isn't the Jesus you and I know and think of, because this Jesus isn't a normal Jesus. This is a giant Jesus. This is a Jesus whose head touches the clouds Jesus. This is like a 60-foot Jesus. This is what I tell my students I call the Godzilla Jesus coming out of the tomb, okay? But then it gets even more bizarre because Jesus is coming out of the tomb, and following him out of the tomb is the cross itself. Now, there's so many things strange about it. First of all, how did the cross get in the tomb? It's not that the Romans normally say, well, since you got crucified, here's a gift to take home with you. You can take this cross. Here, you can have it in the tomb. So we don't know how the cross got in the tomb. But here's the thing. How is it following Jesus out of the tomb? Is it floating? Is it walk? Do we have a floating cross here following giant Jesus out of the tomb? Just as you think it gets weird enough, then something else happens. The cross starts talking. Now you're thinking, what, am I dreaming? What is going on? So you've got giant Jesus with a floating, walking, talking cross out of Jesus, and this gives you a taste of what the different gospels are. And then when someone comes and goes, oh, just pick whatever gospel suits your fancy. You're thinking to yourself, hold on a second, is there not a place to talk about historical reliability in these texts? Now, I'll give you a second example of this. The first example was the resurrection of Jesus. The second example is Jesus' boy. You may not realize that we have gospels in early Christianity that tell us what Jesus was like as a child. So if you've always had your curiosity piqued, here's your shot, right? You can go and read what's called the infancy gospel of Thomas. By the way, the infancy gospel of Thomas is not to be confused with the gospel of Thomas, discovered by our friend Muhammad Ali. No, the infancy gospel of Thomas was much later, but it tells about Jesus as a boy. And it gets into all the things you'd want to know about what Jesus must have been like as a boy. But here's what's bizarre. Once you start reading it, you realize this is a rather terrifying little Jesus in this story. This is a nightmarish Jesus. This is a scary Jesus. This is an unpredictable little kid Jesus. This little kid Jesus in the infancy gospel of Thomas goes around terrorizing the village he lives in. He bumps into another kid who bumps into him, and he strikes him dead on the spot. And then when the village leaders get on his case about it, he just rises them from the dead. And then another point, he's making these clay pigeons on the Sabbath day, breaking the Sabbath rule. When he's confronted about it, he turns them into real pigeons and they fly away and the evidence is gone. And this little Jesus is not like the Jesus you would think. He's someone that you think, wow, I don't want to have anything to do with this little Jesus. And this is an example, yet again, of the obvious, deep, profound literary embellishments that go on in Gospels outside the canonical four. And you never would know it if you hadn't actually read them. And that leads us to our fourth and final observation. And by the way, there's not just four. These are, I think, good four. I mean, you can make the case much longer than this. Remember where we've gone so far. The canonical Gospels are the earliest we have. Second, the canonical Gospels are the only ones that have a credible shot of being written by the apostles. Third, the canonical Gospels lack the legendary embellishments of later Gospels. And now, fourth and finally, the canonical Gospels were recognized as authoritative from a very early date. One of the questions that we want to ask when we think about which Gospels to trust is a question of which Gospels the early Christians trusted. Which Gospels did they read? Which Gospels did they like? Which Gospels did they copy? Which Gospels did they put on their lists and affirm? Now, here's what the media will tell you, and this is what scholars will say to you. They'll say, oh, in early Christianity, it was a literary free-for-all, and there was no one gospel more popular than another. In fact, in the earliest stages, they would say, it was probably apocryphal gospels that were more popular than even the canonical ones. And it was only later through the machinations of Constantine and the political pressure that they ended up forcing Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John on a church that really never liked them very much anyway. I can tell you that narrative is everywhere. It's on the internet. It's in web chat rooms. It's in books, unfortunately. It's in all kinds of places, and it's patently false. When you look at early Christianity and ask which Gospels were the most popular, which were the most read, which are the ones the early church affirmed, from as far back as we can see, it is almost unanimously Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. A few examples. Irenaeus in the 2nd century. We ask him, how many Gospels, Irenaeus? He says 4, and only 4. In fact, so certain that there's 4, you could almost think of it as the 4 directions of the world, or the 4 creatures around the throne, or the 4 covenants of the Bible, or, Irenaeus has all these explanations, but for him it's 4 and only 4. Our earliest canonical list, the Muratorian Fragment. You read it and go, wonder how many Gospels people are reading. The answer is 4, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Clement of Alexandria, also in the 2nd century. We ask him, how many Gospels should we read? What's interesting about Clement is he actually read lots of things. And he actually read a lot of other Gospels. And sometimes he even quote from them from time to time. But when you ask him which ones belong in our canon, Clement was very obviously clear. He said 4 and only 4, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. How about the apocryphal Gospels? How'd they do in early Christianity? Were they wildly popular, as we're told? What's interesting is when you look in the early church, the evidence for them is incredibly scant in terms of their impact and popularity. I'll give you a few little historical tidbits to flesh this out. Here's one for you. We don't have a single manuscript in the entire history of early Christianity that includes apocryphal Gospels and canonical Gospels in the same book. And this is a stunning fact, because I can tell you, when we look at early Christianity, we see manuscripts all the time of the Gospels. We have thousands of them. And lots of times we have manuscripts that include multiple Gospels in a single volume. We have tons of these. But here's what we never find. We never find multiple Gospels in a single volume when they're mixed between canonical and apocryphal. So, for example, we never find a codex anywhere that's got, say, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Thomas, or Matthew, Mark, John, and Peter. We don't find an example of that once, anywhere, ever. Now, if you think about that for a moment, how is that possible if we're to believe that in early Christianity that these apocryphal texts were just everywhere and no one made a difference or a distinction between them? No, they made a distinction. A second little tidbit. We don't have a single canonical list anywhere that contains both canonical and apocryphal Gospels. It's interesting. Christians, very early on in the 2nd century, we know for sure, began to list books that they received in their canons. They began to write it out. Here's the ones we recognize. Here's the ones we have. We have all kinds of examples of these lists, starting in the 2nd century. They particularly become prolific in the 4th and 5th century and beyond. Here's one thing that's interesting about these lists. We don't have a single example of any list anywhere where they mix these Gospels together. Whenever you read these lists, guess what the Gospels are? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. One last little historical tidbit for you about the popularity of these apocryphal Gospels. We can know something about the popularity of books by the number of manuscripts they left behind, the quantity of copies that we can get our hands on. You see, in the ancient world, you didn't replicate a book by going down and running off copies on a copy machine or going to the publisher. You'd have to make hand copies by a scribe, and they would get circulated throughout the world. So you really just copy the books you really wanted to read and have spread. And so when you look in the historical record, we can tell what books were popular by the fragments of those books left behind, because then we can tell which books were mostly copied and mostly read and mostly circulated. So the number of manuscripts left behind is incredibly important to know which books were popular. When we look at our canonical Gospels, we have thousands of manuscripts. I can't get into the numbers now. When you look at the whole New Testament, we have well over 5,700 copies. But in the canonical Gospels themselves, we have several thousand copies. How many copies do we have of, say, the Gospel of Thomas? The answer is 3. In fact, they're very fragmentary, poorly preserved 3rd century Greek texts that you can hardly get any text at all from that. The Gospel of Thomas that was discovered by Muhammad Ali was not in Greek, it was in Coptic. When we're talking about manuscripts, we're always talking about these numbers in Greek. You could do the same thing with the other canonical Gospels. Some apocryphal Gospels. Some apocryphal Gospels have left 0 manuscripts. And the only reason we know they exist is because a patristic writer just says something about them and mentions them. Some apocryphal Gospels are never mentioned by any patristic writer ever. And we only know about them because we happen to randomly find one in the desert. I'll give you examples. The Gospel of Mary. We actually only have about 3 copies of the Gospel of Mary, but no patristic writer even mentions its name. Not even mentions its name. We wouldn't even know it exists if we hadn't just found these things in the desert. Now, those are just little tidbits to make the larger point. And the larger point is simply this. When someone comes along and says, oh, in the early church, it was all the same. It was a level playing field. Everyone was reading whatever they wanted to read. There was no preference for certain books. It was just a free-for-all. It was only later this got settled. That's not true. In fact, the historical evidence is all pointing in one direction, and we're not talking leaning in one direction. We're talking a mountain, a flood, a torrent of evidence in the other direction. And so when you look at the question of which Gospels were received, were read, were valued, were appreciated, it is not even close. It is almost uniformly, almost always from the very beginning, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, as we draw these 4 points together, and as we draw this session to a close, these 4 points hold together the fundamental point from the beginning we're making. And that is, despite our culture's quest for diversity, and despite our culture's desire to have their sort of choice of worldview and choice of philosophy and choice of religion as if it's kind of a cafeteria-style thing where you go in and you just pick what you want and it's all the same. That is the narrative of our world. But that narrative comes to a screeching halt when you actually look at the historical evidence. When you actually look at the historical evidence, that narrative can't be sustained. And when it comes to the 4 Gospels, that narrative certainly can't be sustained. And when it comes to the 4 Gospels, the record has always been clear. If you want to know what Jesus is like, if you want to know who he was and what he did and what he said, there's only one place Christians have really ever gone. And it's the same place that we go today, and that's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Amen. Let me pray for us. Lord, we thank you for the clarity of your word. Lord, we thank you for its power. Lord, we thank you for its historical presence, that we can look back and see that you've made it clear what testimony you're leaving behind for the person of Jesus. Lord, encourage us today with that truth. May we leave this place confident, renewed in our trust that your word is true and reliable. And may we be able to articulate that to a world who desperately needs to hear the message of grace. We pray this in Christ's name. Amen.
Again, the links to this are in the notes up on the website, and a lot of other interesting things you can go watch. Some of them like this, long, some of them real short form. I really think you will enjoy it. I'm hoping it's a resource, not just for this moment, but for the future as you eventually leave Sunset, if you do, and go out to minister, that when these questions come up or you have the opportunity to study more on it, here's at least sort of a beginning place for some of that. And you're not at the whim of just the popular press or what the latest thing Bart Ehrman has got on the bestseller list to try to come up with the answers to this. Okay, well, when we come back together on Monday, we're going to be moving away from this. We're going to talk about persecution in the early church. We're just going to have one class session on that. But I will, at the very beginning of that class, I'm going to ask you a question that we could try to answer. That I'm going to ask you right now, and that is, knowing more now about the New Testament, that we don't have the original autographs, that the earliest, even fragmentary copies we have may date, like the Gospel of John fragment, the John Rylands papyrus, may date 20 to 40 or 50 years after it. And yet now we have this New Testament as gradually more and more documents have been found, and we have them in Greek and now translated into English, and we read them. Why can we still have confidence that this is the Word of God? And we ought to have some reasonable answer for ourselves. And if we don't, you probably don't need to be out there trying to preach it. All right. Thank you very much.